welcome Senator Ted Cruz. How are you, sir?
Mark, good evening. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. I want to ask you a couple of questions here.
Sure.
First of all, you're a constitutionalist. You have this Texas case that's brought. It's brought to the Supreme Court. And there's a provision in our Constitution that says that, you know, when a state is suing a state, the Supreme Court, quote, shall, unquote, have original jurisdiction. Isn't that correct?
You are correct.
And so shall was read out of the Constitution there. Now we have a provision in our Constitution with the word shall shows up against that the Congress shall count the electoral votes. And now it's like the Holy Grail. That is, Congress is supposed to go through a ministerial task and count electors, even if members of Congress know full well that in some states the elections were unconstitutional because Article 2, where the Republican legislatures was intentionally circumvented by a state Supreme Court or state Secretary of State and so forth. It's funny how these words change, isn't it?
Well, there are lots of people playing games. This is obviously a politically divided moment, and you're seeing a lot of Democrats, a lot of folks in the media are screaming, how dare anyone want to examine claims of voter fraud, that if you want to do so, you somehow want to destroy the pillars of democracy. And that is a view that is neither consistent with the Constitution, nor is it consistent with history. And in fact, I think Congress has an obligation to act to defend the integrity of our elections. As you note, the Constitution and the 12th Amendment in particular gives the responsibility of counting the votes to the Congress, to both sessions, both houses in joint session presided over by the Vice President of the United States. And that responsibility, the framers of the Constitution knew what they were doing when they gave responsibilities to an elected branch like the Congress. They don't give ministerial responsibilities. They could have just given it to a local clerk in D.C. if it simply involved handing a piece of paper over. It doesn't. It involves judgments about what votes are legal or permissible or consistent with the law and what votes are not. And it's always involved judgments. And by the way, the Democrats know this because 4 times in recent years they have objected to the counting of electors. They did it in 1969. They did it in 2001. They did it in 2005. They did it in 2016. So the Democrats know full well that is the case. And none of those instances, when it was Democrats objecting, did the press light their hair on fire and run around saying, it's a coup, democracy is dying. It is all absurd. It is all driven by the fact that the press and the Democrats hate Donald Trump. My view is Congress should fulfill our responsibility under the Constitution to consider serious claims of voter fraud. And that's why I assembled a coalition of 11 senators that we are going to vote to object to the electors, not to set aside the election. I don't think that would actually be the right thing to do, but rather to press for the appointment of an electoral commission that can hear the claims of voter fraud, hear the evidence, and make a determination as to what the facts are and the extent to which the law was complied with.
I want to get back to shall count. You would assume that those who wrote the 12th Amendment, those who wrote the Constitution generally, that they would assume that the electors come to them, the electors' votes come to them based on a constitutional lawful process, correct?
Yes and no. That's certainly how it's supposed to operate, but they were also the framers were wise as to the way of politics. They were. Let
me restate this because let me restate this. What I'm trying to say is this. I heard one of our friends on radio today say, "You shall count. You have no option." It says "shall," and I'm thinking, now wait a minute. You telling me that the men who wrote this language said even if something comes to you and you know it's unconstitutionally generated, you have to vote for it? Don't you take an oath of office, too, that says I'll uphold the Constitution of the United States? How can you vote for that if you know that elector came to you unconstitutionally? Go ahead.
Well, the framers knew there would be disputes. This was easy to anticipate. And so they assigned the responsibility to an elected body that had democratic legitimacy. That's not why it's not some federal district judge in the District of Columbia who receives the votes. It's why it's not the archivist of the United States who counts the votes. It is the elected Congress, because they knew that these issues would be disputed. In 1800, there was a closely contested, disputed election. And in trying to determine the right approach to take here, Mark, this is something that I took very seriously. You and I both revere the Constitution. It matters deeply that we follow it and act consistent with the rule of law. And I have to admit, as we were heading into Wednesday with objections, I viewed it as two choices that were being presented to senators, both of which were lousy choices. One choice was vote against the objections to electors, and the reason that's a lousy choice is that would be seen by a great many people, understood as saying, you don't believe voter fraud is significant, you don't believe it occurs. And that's simply not reality, and it's not where a great many members of the Senate are in terms of their beliefs. But the other side, I think all of us are rightly concerned that you don't want to set aside the results of an election just because the candidate you happen to back didn't prevail. That's not a good standard or precedent either. And so what I did is I tried to study, well, what has happened in the last 230 years of our nation's history? And I think the most compelling precedent is the presidential election of 1876. That was an election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. It's a very close election. And there were three states in that election, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where there were very serious allegations of voter fraud. Now, what did Congress do in 1877? It didn't throw its hands up in the air and say, we can't decide anything. We have no ability, our hands are tied. No. Congress did something very different. It appointed what it called an electoral commission. That consisted of 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, and 5 Supreme Court justices. And that commission was charged with hearing the evidence and making a determination about the disputed ballots. That's what happened in 1877. And what I did on looking to that precedent, I think that's the most apt precedent, is I reached out to a number of my colleagues and assembled a coalition of 11 senators. I convinced 10 other senators to join me in saying we should follow the precedent of 1877. We should object to the electors and use that to press for appointing an electoral commission so these claims can be reviewed by a forum that has credibility, that is impartial, and that can assess them on the merits. I think that is a very reasonable position, and it is one that derives from the Constitution, from federal statute, and from centuries of precedent.
And yet, as I watch this, you have a large number of Republican senators who just wash their hands of this. And some of them are attacking. And some of them are said to be conservatives. How do you explain this?
Well, I think there are a variety of views. I do think there are some conservatives who, in good conscience, believe that Congress's discretion is limited. And I've had some conversations with senators and House members who I respect.
What kind of dog is that?
View. That is a little white fur ball, a mutt named Snowflake.
Oh, that's great.
Who is running and barking at the door right now. And
I'm sorry, I'm a dog lover.
Joy.
Anyway, go ahead.
I think there are conservatives in both houses who genuinely believe that, and I don't fault them for coming to that determination. I think there are also some Republicans in both houses who are not conservatives, but who are piously and self-righteously preening, who are moralizing, that anyone who believes that when the framers gave to Congress the authority to supervise the counting of the votes, that they meant for the Congress to actually use that authority to vindicate the Constitution, that we see some Republicans, all of the media and all of the Democrats, but sadly some Republicans who are huffing and puffing and suggesting, how dare you have that interpretation. And to be honest, Mark, what I'm urging people on all sides to do is just calm down, count to 10. We have a responsibility to do.
I only count to 5, by the way.
When our country is so divided, when there is so much acrimony, I actually think elected officials have a responsibility to be calm and sober and to follow the law. And that's what I'm trying to do, and it's what I'm urging all of my colleagues to do.
The Democrats are all going to vote against all of this.
Yep.
Do you think you'll get more than 10 to support you? I'm just curious.
So I'm confident we'll get 12. There are a total of 11 who are with me, and then Josh Hawley also said he would object. So we will get those 12. I think we'll get more than that. I don't think right now it would take something truly extraordinary to get a majority in both houses, which is what we need. And one of the things that's important for your listeners to understand,
20 seconds.
There are a lot of good people across the country who have been led to believe if only one House member and one senator object, then suddenly the election results are set aside. You and I both know that's not the case.
No,
that's the only way to do that is if you have a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate.
Ted Cruz, thank you, my friend, and thank you for taking up this battle as well. Take care of yourself.